Another episode with slides? We're really on the cutting edge of providing teaching content in new and exciting ways.
Well, some people like to get the old slide projector out and take a trip down memory lane.
You forgot we were shooting today, didn't you?
Oh, like you listening to an audio tape of my teaching in the car is like virtual reality?
Touché. Proceed.
For the longest time, scholars have credited Luther for never wanting to be a Lutheran. They cite a time when he exhorted his followers to never call themselves Lutheran. However, most people don't realize Luther's views on being a Lutheran actually changed. What brought about that change? It was when the Lutherans finally had their chance to put forth their Christian confession at the Diet of Augsburg in 1530.
There, they presented to the Holy Roman Emperor a document known as the Augsburg Confession. In order to understand the relevance and significance of the Augsburg Confession, it's helpful to be familiar with three things: historical events and context that shaped the Augsburg Confession, the documents contributing to the writing, and lastly, the reception and later use of the confession. In this episode, we'll talk about the documents that contributed to it. Do you want me to advance the slides too?
One of the foundational texts informing the content of the Augsburg Confession is known as the Schwabach Articles. This was a set of secret articles drafted beginning in July of 1529 by Luther, Melanchthon, and others for the purpose of laying down the theological conditions the Saxons considered non-negotiable. Keep in mind, at the time, there were other reformers besides Luther. One of the more influential was Luther and Zwingli. His opposition to Luther's views on the Lord's Supper caused political divisions rooted in theological debates. Therefore, the Saxon princes deemed it essential that in order to establish a league to defend against the emperor, they needed theological agreement. In order to be accepted into the evangelical league, a league that would also serve as a military and political alliance, theological agreement had to be found.
A few months after the drafting of the Schwabach Articles, in October, the Marburg colloquy convened. This was a meeting brokered by Philip of Hesse, a young prince who wanted to negotiate an agreement between a number of Protestant theologians in order to try to work out a theological basis for what he hoped would be a political alliance. His hope was that Luther and Zwingli might be able to come to some agreement.
During the course of those meetings, Luther drafted 15 statements that summarized the Wittenberg teachings. The statements basically mirrored the Schwabach Articles from just a few months earlier. To Luther's surprise, everyone there agreed to 14 out of the 15. The one they could not agree on, and the one which the conversations pivoted, centered on this key question: whether Christ is truly present or not in the Lord's Supper.
The question was this: does "is" really mean "is" in the bread and wine? In other words, did Jesus mean it when he said, "This is my body" and "This is my blood"? Luther was steadfast in asserting that when Jesus said, "This is my body," he meant it. It isn't ours to speculate about how that is the case, but to confess that it is the case because Jesus said so. Zwingli would not agree to this and insisted that this was figurative or symbolic language only. Eventually, this lack of agreement led to the downfall of the Zwinglian movement. Pulling all these documents and circumstances together now, let's go to the Diet of Augsburg itself. On January 21, 1530, Charles V summoned a diet to meet at Augsburg on April 8th.
And this time Charles would be there himself. Since the end of 1529, the evangelical princes were concerned that the emperor would step in, suppress the evangelical faith, and abolish the reforms accomplished by the visitations. Charles V's motivation was to unify the empire to help face the Turkish threat, among other things. So there were a lot of non-theological matters at play in calling the Diet of Augsburg.
On March 11th, Elector John received the imperial summons to attend the Diet. Because part of the preparation required for the Diet was to justify, on theological grounds, the reform measures previously taken by the government, the elector sent orders to Luther, Jonas Bugenhagen and Melanchthon, to write the theological opinion. They did so, and Melanchthon presented it to the court in Torgau on March 27th. The result was the Torgau Articles. A copy of these articles does not exist. We only know that they were created and presented.
Keep in mind, Luther was still an outlaw, subject to being arrested and killed by the Roman Catholic authorities. Consequently, he himself was unable to travel to Augsburg for the Diet. He stayed in Coburg, instead a town on the border of his home territory. This is important to note because it meant that Luther's input in the Augsburg Confession was limited. All he could do was write letters back and forth to Melanchthon and the other representatives at Augsburg.
On April 24th, the group representing Luther's theology set out for Augsburg and arrived there on May 2nd. Melanchthon immediately began working on the materials available to him. He discovered within a few days, though, things had changed while he was traveling from Coburg to Augsburg. 2 days after his arrival, Melanchthon was given a copy of 404 articles their old adversary Johann Eck had published and presented to the emperor. Eck's articles analyzed bits and pieces of the reformers' writings and charged the reformers with heresy, a very serious charge in those times. Eck did this in hopes of getting a formal condemnation from the emperor toward the Lutherans.
No doubt these 404 articles were in the back of Melanchthon's mind as he continued to restructure and rewrite the drafts of the confession. On May 11th, Melanchthon had completed the draft, and the elector had it sent to Luther, authorizing Luther to continue the editing process and to make any additions or deletions. Luther sent the work back 4 days later with these comments. "It pleases me very much. I know nothing to improve or change it, nor would this be appropriate since I cannot step so softly and quietly."
Now here's an important question to consider. What did Luther actually mean with that comment? It can certainly be seen in both a positive and a negative light. The answer to that question is still up in the air, although there have been many attempts to claim one side or the other as the right answer.
To heighten the political tensions and complicate matters further, unexpectedly the secret Schwabach Articles were delivered into the emperor's hands. The emperor outright rejected these articles, and as a result, the heat was turned up on the elector, and the weight of the Augsburg Confession loomed even greater.
For the next month, Melanchthon and others continued to rework the document, changing mostly the latter articles. And note, there are 2 divisions of articles. There are the undisputed articles, which are the first 21, and then there are the disputed articles, which are 22 through 28. It is these latter ones, 22 to 28, in which Melanchthon did most of his revising.
On June 25th, the time had come. The confession was read aloud to the emperor in German. But here's another twist. Both a German and a Latin copy were handed to the emperor.
And the 2 versions, the Latin and German editions, were not identical, something that leaves scholars a lot to talk about nearly 500 years later.
Melanchthon's confession was not the only one presented to the emperor in the Augsburg, however.
Because of some prior disagreements on the use of the Lord's Supper, reformers in the cities of Strasbourg, Constance, Memmingen, and Lindau presented a different confession called the Tetrapolitan Confession.
Due to the necessity of political and military alliances, however, a year later, these same cities dropped their confession and signed the Augsburg Confession.
As a rebuttal to the Augsburg Confession, and under the influence of the emperor, Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio drafted the Confutatio Confessionis Augustana.
This was a response to the individual articles of the Augsburg Confession. That rebuttal was read aloud in German to the Emperor Charles V on August 3rd. He demanded that the evangelicals accept the Confutatio even before its text had been conveyed to them.
Not surprisingly, they did not accept the rebuttal, and any attempted negotiations over this failed. The reformers were then given the task to write a defense of their confession.
That defense, formally called an apology, was rejected by the emperor on September 22nd.
The Diet was then adjourned, making it clear that the original Edict of Worms in 1521 still stood.
Luther was still deemed a heretic and an enemy of the state, and it was illegal to propagate his theology.
Clearly, Charles V did not negotiate a settlement, but had instead sided with the Roman Catholics.
The result of doing so, war between Roman Catholics and Protestants for years to come. I think that went well.
Intense, for sure.